share.
Thank you for that introduction, and I will share my screen shortly. I just have to find it. Yeah, here it is.
We have time, so no hurry.
Okay.
Hello, Arturo. Everyone, as with previous invited talks, I suggest we wait until until the time, because some people arrive shortly, before the talk starts, and I don't want to disadvantage them. What time is it in Houston?
It is 6:57.
You're functioning. How much coffee have you had already?
No, what happens is when I have to wake up early, of course, I wake up extra early. So I really did, since 4:30, I even had Beatriz email me, and please email me an hour before, because I didn't want to get the time change wrong. I knew I would wake up. I just didn't want it to be 8 o'clock or 6 o'clock. I mean, I could show up early. So anyway, yeah, I woke up extra early and then went back to sleep and then woke up again. Then finally I said, okay, it's time to get up.
Yeah, so that makes you well prepared for the talk, because I'm really bad early in the morning. I can barely function before I had a bucket full of coffee, of course.
Yeah, well, at 9 o'clock tonight, I'm sure I won't be worth anything.
Yeah, I also wanted to pick up on the point Antonella was making at the beginning of her talk, that although this conference is online, hopefully we meet offline one day when we're allowed by the power that be, and hopefully it's going to be next year. So as advertised, I don't remember exactly the text of our advertisement email, but as advertised, we plan this event or series of events as spread between 2 years, and this is our first attempt to do it online, but we really hope to have a follow-up event next year, 2021, sometime late summer, maybe September, when we will try and organize something offline in Moscow and invite you all there and see where the whole field went between now and then. So just so that you know, follow the emails, and we also try to advertise it on social networks like Twitter and Facebook. So we're getting to the time. I think maybe a couple more minutes and we could start. As with the previous talk, Bea Bermudez will be chairing it, but I will be around.
Yes, thank you, Andre. I think we are more or less on time already. Maybe we can wait just a couple of minutes more, just in case, until 4 rough, and then let's start, just in case someone pop us.
Bea, just to confirm, how long?
We'll have around 1 hour approximately, and then we will have around 20-30 minutes for questions. So it's not really rushed. You can take your time, around 1 hour, more or less.
Okay.
Yeah, so the slot is 1.5 hours. It's up to you how you use it up, but we usually have around an hour for the talk and half hour for questions, something like that.
Okay.
So until around 5 p.m. and then, so 1 hour. And then you can, I will manage the questions for you. So you can start when you want.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here, I guess, later in the afternoon for some of you and early in the morning for me. So hold on, let's see how this works. Oh, I guess I have to, do I use my, okay. So, sorry. I'd like to start kind of at the end, which is to thank the people and the funding organizations that help the work to be done. You know, I guess the saying in the US is that it takes a village. So yes, yeah, it does take it. And so I start at the roots of our field, really, in terms of the brain bases of bilingualism, with the 3 neuropsychologists at the bottom, and then lots of other people that have helped out along the way, and funding agencies, including the sun and the rain. Maybe it's rainy in Germany, so that's why I put the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung in the rain. So I took an abstract of my talk, and there's this thing called Simple Writer, which allows you to write. You have to use the 100 most frequent words in the English language, and so it turns out the word 1,000 is not one of the 1,000 most frequent words, so I have to use 1,000. In any case, this is an abstract of my talk, which is 2 tongues, brains, and child growing, a brain breakout view. So the question is, how do people learn to speak with 2 tongues? In the last years, people have written more and more studies using brain seeing machines. Just a second. Brain seeing machines to look inside people's heads. Using these yardsticks, know-how studies have found that when a second tongue is learned and how well it is spoken matters. In the last few years, know-how studies found that small grow pockets inside each of us might help some tongue speakers stop and start more easily than others. This stop and starting could help them speak in 2 tongues better or worse, or may make some people learn a second tongue better. Today, you will learn about how the brains of 2 tongue speakers keep them in one brain. You will also learn about how child growing studies using brain seeing machines help us to think about learning 2 tongues. At the end, I will tell you about a new way of thinking that pushes the idea that speaking 2 tongues is like looking at clouds in the sky. When 2 clouds hit each other, they can make big light flashes and a big noise. Putting things together that add up to more than each part helps us know more about thinking and talking for all of us. This new shape thinking path is called breakout brain counting, or brain breakout for short. Very hard to read that. So that is the most frequent words, and I'll come back to that idea at the end. But first I wanted to start with control and bilingualism. I think there's a lot of discussion about what role does cognitive control play in the life of bilinguals. And really, you know, the big discussion had been, and I guess still continues to be to some extent, it's still in the literature, although there's I wouldn't say less debate, but it's kind of morphed a little bit. But there was this idea of, like, in 2012, you can see this headline over here on the left side of the screen, why bilinguals are smarter. And then on the right side of the screen, a few years later, the bitter fight over the benefits of bilingualism, right? So the question is, and what I did, this was a few years ago, so I haven't updated it recently, but I actually made a word cloud of all the, so I took all of the abstracts that had bilingual advantage in them, right? And then I made a word cloud, and the size of the person's name is actually how many of those abstracts are by that person. So you can see, of course, that Ellen Bialystok is in the middle of the figure, and then there are people like Ken Papp, who are also there, Tamar Golan, you know, Viorica Marian, Fergus Craik, and then somewhere down here at the bottom, I think, I can't see it because it's being blocked by the screen, I think I'm there. So I'm a very, very minor contributor to this. And you can see Antonella's here as well. So what's the sort of main hypothesis, right? So the critical hypothesis actually, and the critical hypothesis is that the bilinguals have better inhibitory skills than monolinguals, because they need to inhibit the irrelevant language constantly, ignore irrelevant information, monitor, resolve conflicting information, etc. Right? So the idea is this idea of far transfer, right, from language to other cognitive domains. And the transfer literature is somewhat controversial, right? So there is some discussion that, in fact, there's very little evidence of far transfer, but this would be evidence of it. And I have to say that what I call the most modern wave of this bilingual advantage discussion really, I think, starts in around 2004. I've actually traced, I remember when I was in graduate school, there was a book, a green book called Cognitive Processing in Bilinguals. I think it was published in '92. And in that chapter, there's, in that book, there's a chapter by Bialystok where she talks about something like the bilingual edge, right? So it wasn't the advantage yet. So that's about 12 years before this. And then a little bit, in '89, I want to say, there was a little bit of work by Bialystok looking at, I guess, meta-linguistic awareness by bilinguals, right? So, and of course, the idea goes back to the '30s, really, where they found that bilinguals showed lower IQ than monolinguals, and the conclusion was that bilinguals somehow had a disadvantage. And then future studies in the 1960s, where they began to look at that. So they look at and show that, in fact, there was no disadvantage. And then eventually in the '90s, a little bit of discussion, and then really this like explosion of articles starting in around 2004. And in this study, what's now classic study, right? Although it's not that old, this was a Simon task. So in the Simon task, they had to monitor for a color, right? So you get a shape either on the left or the right, and the task is to monitor for the color. So if you monitor for the color, you have to press one button for red and one button for green. And so, of course, what happens is it's like a spatial Stroop task, basically. It's like a side Stroop. So you're monitoring for color with two different button presses on different sides of your body. And the item appears on one side or the other, but you have to ignore the side and attend to the color. And so, of course, when it's incongruent, the side and the color, sorry, get a little bit of tea, it is a little early. So when you get the side and the color mismatching, people are slower than when it's matching. So that's the congruent versus incongruent. And these are young, these are like middle-aged, basically, monolinguals and bilinguals, and older adult monolinguals and bilinguals. And what you can see is that the bilinguals show much smaller effects. You can already see this in middle age, but it's really much smaller in the older adults that are over, I believe, 65 in the study. So the idea, I think this is sort of the modern birth of the new wave of bilingual advantage that seems to have subsided somewhat now. And so this was sort of this finding, right, that there's this advantage that if you're bilingual and you're an older adult, you're able to manage interference better. And the idea was that it would transfer from the linguistic training of having to do this in the real world. There's also a monolingual advantage. This is Tamar Golan's work, right, a few years ago, not too far behind this, the work by Bialystok, in which she asked people to name pictures, right, and they just had to name pictures of bilinguals and monolinguals. This was in English, and what you find is that, so she had them name a series of pictures, and then they had to name them again, right? So they had a whole chunk of pictures, and then they had them again a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth time. And this is typical, right? So this is what they would call repetition priming. If you name the same set of pictures a second time, you get a benefit in reaction time. Not so much in percent correct. You don't know the name of a picture, you don't know it. But there's a little bit of a benefit for the bilinguals, right? Pretty much flat, but the big effect is this drop in reaction time. And what you see is that no matter how many times the bilinguals name these pictures, now this is a monolingual experiment, right? So it's only in one language. They never match that of the monolinguals, right? So this would be called a monolingual advantage, if you will, in single language picture naming. So one of the questions we had was, I mean, we've always been interested in this question of flexibility, right? So if there's this, possible disadvantage, right, or advantage for monolinguals, but an advantage for bilinguals, right, what might that reveal to us, right? And so it turns out that there's a literature now, somewhat more verified, that bilinguals outperform monolinguals on novel word learning, right? And also by Marian Kaushanskaya, right? And then Cristina Sanz, who's done some work looking, this was a few years ago, looking at Catalan-Spanish bilinguals who were better at English learning relative to Spanish monolinguals. So we wanted to see, okay, what's going on with this? How can we make sense of this, word learning? And if there might be some, slowness in naming in a single language, does that maybe represent a latent ability to possibly learn new vocabulary? So we actually went out and taught a bunch of monolinguals and bilinguals words that were either cognates, right, that looked like English or not. And so we did this with, again, Spanish-English bilinguals, and I think it's really important to define what types of bilinguals. So I think there are different words that people use different labels for the bilinguals that we've tested. That's the majority of the group that we have here in Texas and in the US, more globally, right? Which are, some people call them heritage learners, right? So they speak Spanish at home. Some people call them sequential early Spanish bilinguals, Spanish-English bilinguals. And other people in the education literature, they used to call them English language learners, but now they've changed that label because everybody's an English language learner, including monolingual English-speaking kids, right? So now they call them dual language learners. So depending on your literature or your field, you'll use those different words. Basically, we would use the word early Spanish-English bilinguals, meaning Spanish at home mostly, and although that's a sort of interesting open question about how much English they get. The claim is they don't get any English, but I actually I don't have a study planned, but I'd like to do a study where we actually compared apples to apples, apples to oranges, if you will. So Spanish-speaking children in Mexico, right, matched on socioeconomic status with Spanish-speaking children here in the US, where the claim is that they don't hear any English. And I'm guessing that they would be different, just because even though they may not speak English in their immediate environment, there's English, and that somehow is changing either their behavior or their brain reactions to the language. In any case, and then 16 English monolinguals. What we did is we had them learn a set of words with flashcards for 1 to 2.5 hours. So we got them up to 90% correct. Some people were faster than others. We got them up to 90% correct. We trained them, and I'll show you the stimuli in a second. And then we stuck them in the MRI scanner, and we had them do a task, and I'll explain that in a second. So the words were, so they would see a word in English, and then on the other side, they had to memorize the translation. So we had some that were cognates, like brother and bruder, night and nacht, and then some that were non-cognates, such as horse and pferd, or basket and cob. And then we also had English words that they didn't have to study, of course, where we asked them in the scanner to look at these words. And when they were in the scanner, what they had to do was make a living, non-living judgment. Now, we did have some discussions about words that people considered to be non-living. So like hair, for example, is technically non-living, but some people may call it, if the majority of people call hair living, then we were okay with that. We weren't really trying to be absolutely correct about it. We just wanted to make sure that they agreed. Right. So we had some words we had to throw out because people just didn't agree on whether it was living or non-living. We didn't include those. We only included ones where people were very consistent. So this was an example of the experiment, right? They see a word, they make a living, non-living judgment. Now remember, they're learning these translations outside the scanner. When we put them in the scanner, we're having them make a living, non-living judgment. So this is a really hard task. They haven't been prepared. It's like a new task entirely. I guess we did in the consent tell them, and if they read it really carefully, they would know that what task they were going to do. But when they were training, they were just learning the translations. And what we found was, actually interestingly, for this task, for the English words, the monolinguals and bilinguals look indistinguishable. So there was no longer a bilingual or monolingual advantage for single language in making these living non-living judgments. What we did find was that the bilinguals were faster than the monolinguals, which was really interesting, right? So for the new words, for the German words, and again, we chose German because there is kind of an interesting aside, right? The word Bruder, although we consider it a Germanic word, but we've actually, in other studies, I'll talk about this a little bit later, have gone back and looked at the etymology. It turns out that Bruder comes from frater. So technically, it's not a Germanic word. It's actually a Latinate. It's a Latin-based word, but we consider it a Germanic word because, I mean, okay, frater and Bruder, okay, maybe historically they have some connection, but in fact, right, Bruder looks like brother, and that doesn't, to me, doesn't look like a Latin word. But a linguist probably would have a long conversation with me trying to educate me about why it is. But in any case, that's really an exception. What we were really trying to avoid are words like honesty, truth, certainly the Greek words like problem, climate, words like that, that would actually be what I call triple cognates, right? So the Latin words tend to go across German, Spanish, and English. So we chose Germanic words because, if anything, the monolinguals would have more training on Germanic words than the bilinguals, because the bilinguals would have Spanish, Latin-based, and of course some Arabic words and other words, and English, right, which has Latinates and Germanic words. So they would actually, the bilinguals in principle, would get fewer chances to see Germanic words because it's spread across the two languages. So the fact that they were learning these German words and, they were faster was interesting. Right? It suggests it's a word learning effect. The other thing we did in the scanner, of course, is scan them and look at their brain activity. And what you could see, if you compare the brain activity across the two groups, is that the monolinguals show activity in areas we would classically call cognitive control areas. So the caudate nucleus, the anterior cingulate cortex, caudate involved in sort of rule discussion about like rule conditional learning, rule learning. The anterior cingulate and error monitoring, right? Supplementary motor area by supplementary motor, so it explains itself. And then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, an area involved in cognitive control. You can see it here as well. So this is just for the cognate effects, and this is for all the German words. For monolinguals compared to bilinguals. When we compare bilinguals to monolinguals, we see activity in the left putamen, an area we can discuss what it's exactly involved with. Whether it's cognitive control or motor control. I tend to call it a motor and cognitive control area. And so the two circuits that are used differentially by the two groups, they indicate that there are different ways to do this. And the way we interpreted it was that the monolinguals were using some kind of higher level, more explicit semantic strategy during early word learning than the bilinguals, who somehow used some kind of motor-based control. And we haven't, this is just a finding, we haven't really followed up on it to look beyond that, but it does suggest that, again, right, there's some flexibility in the system of bilinguals to be able to learn, right, these new words. And they do them in a different way. So language experience matters, but in this case, what we've looked at is actually a new task, right? And how well they learn this new task, which fits in with the idea from Stocco and Pratt, they've been doing work on the basal ganglia and novel rules, and some modeling work as well by Andrea Stocco and Chantal Pratt, looking at how the basal ganglia may be able to learn new rules in bilinguals because of their exposure to two languages. So we've also done a series of retrospective studies, right? So looking back, so this was kind of like, we take two groups and then we look at how well they train. One thing that became interesting to us, and I used the word the grow pockets. I was when I was reading my abstract, I'm like, what are grow pockets? And I was like, okay, grow pockets, I guess those are genes. So if you use the 1,000 most frequent words in English for genes, it would be like a grow pocket. I'm not sure what else you would call it. But in any case, I became interested in this work really by chance, actually. Christian Fiebach, who's a colleague of mine, we had worked on some earlier work looking at age of acquisition, and then I was looking at his webpage and I realized that he had this new work on genetics and cognitive control. And there's this particular gene that's associated with striatal dopamine. So the striatum is, again, the putamen and the caudate, mostly at the level of the caudate. And it turns out that carriers of a gene, they actually have fewer receptors, what are called D2 receptors for dopamine. And so there's more dopamine flowing in the system, meaning that they're more flexible, right? And again, right, it's a subtle difference. So when you look at the task switching literature, those who are carriers show smaller switching effects. And I thought this is a really interesting thing because this is something that's genetic, right? There's an association between a gene and cognitive control. And what would happen if we could cross that association, right? We could look at it relative to monolingual and bilingual. So we've done that in some studies. We've looked at the differences in 3 studies, right? In the first study, what we did is we just looked at our Hispanic bilinguals and our monolinguals, and we looked at what proportion of them had this A1+, right? The one that yielded, that is associated with, associated with more dopamine, more flexibility, lower switching costs. If you're more flexible, you can switch more efficiently, and so you show a smaller cost. Again, these are milliseconds, right? These are not 100, 500, 3-second effects, 500 milliseconds. They're really like 20, 30 millisecond effects, but still reliable. So when we did that, when we looked at the proportion, we found that in fact, just make sure I'm not showing you the data in a second. No, we found that in fact, the bilinguals, right, Hispanic bilinguals, showed a higher proportion of them showed this A1+ polymorphism, right? And so the monolinguals look like the rest of the literature. About 1/3 of them are A1+, but for the bilinguals, 2/3 of them were A1+. And so we speculate that, again, it's a speculation, right? Because we'd have to look at the population of bilinguals who don't end up at the University of Houston. But we speculated that somehow the flexibility might be present, might be more advantageous for bilingual speakers who are Spanish speakers going through the English-speaking school system to get to college, right? So this flexibility gives them an extra boost. Now, it's not that it's 100% of them, because 1/3 of them were not carriers, so they made it through as well. But it was just that it had flipped the proportion. And so we wondered whether there might be, if we go back to the study here, right, this finding here, right, is it the case that our bilinguals, the group that we're sampling from, is different already from the monolinguals for whatever language experience they have, right? And we assume that it's a bilingual effect, and it may be a bilingual effect, but the question is, is there something about having to go through this trajectory of learning a second language and then going to college in it that somehow is being moderated by the genetic sort of, nature of the person, right? So how much dopamine, how flexible they are. So are we sampling from 2 different groups? And that's why we see an advantage. And I guess if we don't have enough subjects, but if we did, we could ask the question, okay, if we took the A1+s from each group, we know there's larger proportion in one group than the other, would we actually find the same difference or not? So is that a flexibility, and we just have more flexible people in our group, in our bilingual group, relative to our monolingual group? That was a speculation, right? We don't have any data on that. The second study we did was we looked at the age of acquisition, language proficiency, and this DRD2, right, to see if they play a differential role in cognitive control and picture naming tasks. And we found that for some types of tasks, right, age of acquisition and language proficiency play a role, and for a task switching, we call a shape color task switching experiment, that DRD2 plays a role. And so it does really feel like, and DRD2 also, the genetics play a role in some of the other tasks, right? So it becomes this very complex kind of interaction between whatever individual differences. And again, these are at birth, right? And we have to be a little careful about genetics because the effects are very small, and there's been sort of a lot of discussion or reviews that we've gotten about like, okay, how this is just a single gene, you know, how can you make any claims about this? We know about epigenetics, right? And so it's much more complex than this, but somehow this gene, along with age of acquisition and language proficiency, seem to be playing a role in cognitive control and picture naming. So it suggests that there's this very complex interaction between experience, when somebody learns a second language, and then their own nature. And then finally, a last study looked at, when we look at the balance between the two languages, how balanced they are, but also how good they are, that's modulated both by cortical. So we took another gene, we took two genes, cortical dopamine, striatal dopamine, and age of acquisition. So there's this complex interaction between who the person is and how balanced they are in their language proficiency. We're not talking about accent here. This is just language proficiency, sort of, you know, standardized language proficiency tests. And so it suggests, again, that there's this complex interaction between what a person brings to the world and their experience. So this last study is the one, the last one that I mentioned there at the bottom is this study right here, right? So there's this DRD2 gene we just talked about, right, which is associated with dopamine in the striatum. And in the A1 plus group, we said there was high subcortical dopamine. So we can see that there's high subcortical dopamine in this group. And in the A1 minus group, there's low subcortical dopamine, right? So you can see that right here. So A1 plus versus A1 minus is high versus low subcortical dopamine. Now, when we look at this other gene, the COMT gene, this particular variant of it, there are three variations, right? With either low cortical this is cortical dopamine, not subcortical, right? Medium cortical dopamine or high cortical dopamine. Right? So we get these different conditions, right? Basically 6 different conditions. And when we look at, so we took a measure of bilingual proficiency. Now this is a measure of both languages. And the way we did it, it's a formula that calculates how balanced they are, but it also calculates how well they speak both languages. So, you know, if they speak both languages well, I'm just turning my camera on here because I see that the sunlight, sorry, changed just a little bit. So you can see it is sunrise here. There we go. I still have that line on the side of my face. Okay, so the proficiency is, right, so how well they speak both languages, but it's also whether they're balanced, right? So they get extra points for being similar in both languages. And the idea was to look at bilingual, you know, balance. So we call it bilingual proficiency. So up is better in both languages, but also equal. And really, we ran a series of regression lines looking at both genes, the DRD2, as I showed earlier, subcortical dopamine, the COMT, which is associated with cortical dopamine, and their age of acquisition, when they acquired the second language. And what you can see, and again, that I would take with a grain of salt, sort of what happens before age 5, but definitely afterwards, you can clearly see that some people show worse proficiency with later, or worse balance with later acquisition, and some groups show better balance with later acquisition, right? So, and again, these vary depending on these two genes, right? So we have what a particular person's sort of, you know, level of dopamine is cortically and subcortically interacting with when they learn the second language to produce 2 different profiles of balance in both languages. And that to me was fascinating, right? And this accounts, again, I've had people say here like, well, but wait, I don't know if I'm flexible or inflexible. Maybe that's why I'm not good at. And I say, well, again, you know, we're accounting for about 30% of the variance. So there's 70% of the variance that's still left over beyond the genes and, you know, these 3 factors. There's a lot to be accounted for, but the point is interesting that it matters, right? And basically the way this is a summary of this spaghetti, whatever you would call a spaghetti graph, right? the summary is that early age of acquisition before age 5 probably benefits more from subcortical dopamine. We know these are earlier developing structures and are playing a role in brain development earlier, right, and learning in that at an earlier age. And a later age of acquisition is benefits more from a balanced level of cortical dopamine, right? So again, you know, it's a very complex view of like, you know, the organism, if you will, a human is changing across time. And as they change across time, right, the way that the brain handles, you know, or if you will, the benefits of what brain structures are, the benefit of a particular brain structure will change across time, right? And so we're sort of tying it here to dopamine via the genes. Now, ideally, what we would do is measure dopamine directly, as opposed to through the gene, right? Because the gene is just somehow sort of handling the level of dopamine, and we're hoping to be able to do that, maybe not in kids, but maybe in adults in the future. This is some work, again, looking at an emerging area that we've been started to think about, which is, you know, in aging and natural aging, there is a reduction in dopamine, right? So if we look at D2 receptor binding, we can see that the binding potential of the receptors, right, drops both in frontal cortex, right, for D1 and D2 receptors. And you can just see in blue, right, that, you know, and I always joke with all of my students and my graduate students is that, you know, we were trying to do some work looking at some, you know, getting some data off a computer. And I told them they had two advantages over me. One was they had better fluid intelligence, right? Because we know fluid intelligence drops. It's one of the things that drops with age. And the other is that they knew the computer is better than I did, right? But we do actually see a physiological marker of that, which is a reduction in dopamine with age, right? In young relative to old, right, in other studies. So one of the questions we're going to ask, and we'd like to ask, is to what extent bilinguals who have lower or higher dopamine, how does language switching, if you will, right? And we can also look at cognitive control, but more specifically language control. How does that change across age depending on the level of dopamine? Because at a young age, right, and a young adult, the difference is might be there, but it would be very subtle because there's an overabundance of dopamine. But as dopamine levels drop, we would expect that older adults will start to show a reduction in that dopamine level. And as the dopamine level drops, the differences between those groups should get larger. And so we should begin to see differences in the older adult group where the differences in the young adult group may be negligible or small. So that's a future study. We've also done some work looking at children, again, with the idea of balance, right? And the idea with balance is, this is Pilar Archila Suerte who did this work, looking at balanced and unbalanced. And I didn't mention Kelly Vaughn, we're still working together. She's now an assistant research professor here in Houston at the Medical Center. So she's done all the work on genetics and very interested in switching. Also some work looking at TDCS, right? Transcranial, I lose the acronym, it's a little too early. Basically looking at deactivation of the frontal cortex and its effect on switching. So she's very interested in that type of work. Pilar Archila Suerte was really interested in looking at child development. And so what she looked at was two groups of balanced and unbalanced. So these again are children, right, between the ages of 6 and 10 that are all, you know, second language learners of English at school mostly. And she divided those groups into balanced and unbalanced groups, right? Those who, and when you look at it here, what clearly stands out is that one group has roughly equal proficiency in both languages, and the second group is lower in proficiency in English, right? And then the question, and this could be for many different reasons. It could be experience. It could be, we want to use the word talent or ability, ability to learn a second language. There may be experience. It could be lots of different factors. She tried to control for everything she could, socioeconomic status and all those types of things. So the argument would be that there's something different about these two kids that leads them to be balanced and unbalanced. And the question she asked was, Well, so how does that show up in structure in the brain? So this is cortical thickness. Again, the two groups are balanced and unbalanced. And what you see is, right, less thickness for the balanced group, or more thickness for the unbalanced groups, but we'll focus on less thickness for the balanced groups in areas involved both in cognitive control, right, standard Broca's area, or IFG, inferior frontal gyrus, and then superior temporal gyrus, right? So suggesting that the more balanced group was associated with less thick cortex. And there's a discussion about what that means. This is brain structure, but the suggestion is that it may be more mature, right? But again, we're just, there's something about the balanced group that's reflected in a brain structure difference. The other thing we found was that the more balanced group also showed greater volume in the putamen. Right? Remember a while back, I talked about the putamen being involved in motor and cognitive control. So when we think about the putamen, we could think about it as being involved in motor and cognitive control. And in this particular case, it's interesting that they have greater volume, suggesting that, again, there's a neural correlate to this balanced effect, right? Both in the cortex and subcortically. Right? We've also looked at a series of cross-sectional studies. So this is Pilar's work again. Again, the same 6 to 10-year-old subjects, right? So English monolingual children, then younger bilingual children, and older bilingual children. And again, they were L2 learners of English. When you look at so this is speech versus baseline, right? So this is just when you ask children, so they had to listen to a series of sounds, right? The sounds were something like saf, 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 soft, or actually I think it was saf, soft, saf, soft, saf, soft, saf, soft, or saf, 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 saf. They're just listening to the sounds. And when they hear the sounds, their task is just to listen. And I always worried about what they call these passive listening tasks, because you're worried that they're going to fall asleep. So I was really happy to see that there was bilateral activity in the superior temporal gyrus. This is not anything to write home about. It is what you would expect to find for monolingual children, bilateral activity in the superior temporal gyrus for speech sounds. Not surprising. When we look at the young bilingual children, they show a similar pattern, although weaker, right? So not as much activity, but again, bilateral superior temporal gyrus for 6 to 8-year-old children. So these are at the beginning stages of learning English, right? Of studying in English. And then when we look at the 9 to 10-year-olds, as I like to say, all hell broke loose, right? So basically you get these big, huge chunks of superior temporal gyrus being active. Again, they're not being asked, but they are being asked. There is one aspect of this task which is interesting, right? So when you stick a child in the scanner, and most of the time what they do is they just play these sounds for adults in previous studies. We decided we were going to show a movie of planet Earth, so nothing human, right? But the idea was that they would watch this movie so that they wouldn't basically fall asleep, right? So they'd be watching this movie in the scanner and they'd be hearing these sounds, which is not an unusual task for people to do in the monolingual literature. And we got exactly the pattern we expected to find, which was bilateral activity for the superior temporal gyrus. And when the periods where they don't hear sound, you see, some more greater occipital cortex activity. Not that you don't see it, again, when they do when they do see the movie, right? But the point is here, they're always seeing the movie. So you kind of subtract out the activity for visual processing. And you see not just superior temporal gyrus in this older group, but lots of other brain areas that are active, right? Distinguishing between speech and baseline. So again, I like to remind people, there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of changes happening as this second language is being learned, right? In young childhood, or in childhood, and then now it's, older childhood. And so again, right, the brain is having to adapt to all of these things. And so it's turning on lots of brain areas. There are lots of brain areas active for these speech sounds. And this is just listening to speech sounds. And if we compare the older to the young, we do find activity in 3 different areas. Of course, it's much more subtle. You're comparing very few children in both groups, not very few, but few children, relatively speaking. At the time, it was, you know, a pretty well sized study, but now as time has progressed, probably we'd run double the number of subjects today relative to what we would have done back then. So the effects are not that big, but there are effects in 3 different areas, right? The middle temporal gyrus, the inferior parietal lobule, and the middle frontal gyrus, or very close to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So again, 2 areas involved in cognitive control when we compare the older to the young children, and an area involved in secondary sort of auditory processing, and then a parahippocampal gyrus involved in memory. Right, so we could think about the older children as somehow having to engage these systems more than the younger children, which is interesting because the older children have higher proficiency in English, right, relatively speaking, than the young children. And so, you know, why is that? And so our suggestion is that they're gaining more language proficiency, and so they're engaging more of the brain and cognitive control resources in order to handle those speech sounds, where the young bilingual children really are engaging the sounds as sounds. So speech, again, we don't have time to discuss too much of this, but in a previous paper, Ping Li and I have written about the sensorimotor hypothesis, right? This idea that age of acquisition, sort of emanating from Piaget's sort of view that early learning would be more sensorimotor based, and late learning would become more cognitive, right? So he would call that formal operations. So we took that to the brain and suggested that early learning would be sensorimotor based. That's why you get, again, when there's low proficiency in the early learners, right, in the young children, this very weak superior temporal gyrus activity. As proficiency improves and cognitive skills come online, what you get is not just superior temporal gyrus, but other control-related areas coming in to modulate the processing of speech. So that suggests that the children that are older are doing more with it now. And so that would be like a way to take a snapshot of you know, what the brain is doing at different ages, given the same point of L2 learning. So up until that point, we've talked a lot about flexibility and about learning, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a slightly different issue which came up for me, and I'll go back to the 1,000 most frequent words, right? So this is this really nice work done where I'm blanking on his name right now, but it's called Upgoer 5, and so this is us space team. So basically what this author has done is he's taken all these complex topics and then he's explained them using the 1,000 words people use the most often, right? So the Upgoer 5 is the only flying space car that's taken anyone to another world, right? So that's, again, that. And it's pretty comical. You can read through them, right? So this is the thing to help people escape really fast if there's a problem and everything is on fire, so they decide not to go to space. This is the thing to control which direction the escaping people go. This is the stuff to burn to make the box with the people in it escape really fast. And the place where fire comes out to help them escape, right? So again, the interesting thing about this, right, is that there are all these simple words used. And the point that I did, so I translated this abstract here. So this is an abstract for, I'm involved in a group that does literacy work with Spanish-English bilinguals, right, with heritage learners. And this is one publication of a member of the group in this brain activity in struggling readers before intervention gains. Before intervention relates to future reading gains. And so I took so here's a sentence from that abstract, right, which reads, neural markers for reading-related changes in response to intervention may represent biomarkers that could inform intervention plans as a potential index of the malleability of the reading network in struggling readers. Particularly interesting is the role of activation outside the reading network, especially in executive control networks important for reading comprehension. So I took that and put it into the simple writer to create this one, right? Brain signs that we can see when people learn to read better can be thought of as a body's way of telling us how much a really good way of teaching can help brain areas for bad readers wind themselves together in a better way. Really interesting is how firing of brain areas not used just in reading pushes it ahead, especially in those hard thinking areas of the brain that people use so that they can know what they are reading about. So again, this is very technical language, and this is in the 1,000 most frequent or 1,000 most frequent words, and you can see it's really hard to explain this stuff. And sometimes it's kind of incomprehensible. Somebody asked me about what's this wiring, the brain areas for bad readers wind themselves together. And that was, this is malleability of the reading network in struggling readers, right? So the network is how I had to do it. I said like winding. So, but back to like what the point of this simple writer is for language is, oh, there's a question here. Andrea, did you have a question? I don't know if it can be in the chat or if someone wants to, or should we save it for later?
Yeah, let's save questions for later. Let's do it at the end of the talk.
Okay. So just, okay. So then if we look at the percentage of words and we look at 18-month-olds, so I went to the MacArthur Communication Developmental Inventory, right? Which is this measure that's been used to collect, basically assess child language, right? From a parental report. And we look at the 50 most frequent nouns at 18 months of age, right? We find that the origin of these words in English are from German or Germanic. So things like apple, things like, God, now I'm gonna blank on them. So the Latin ones would be things like maybe like elephant, right? And Germanic would be like apple, would be like mouse, things of that sort, right? So there are many more for the 50 most frequent nouns. If we look at the percentage of this in adult speakers, everyday English, right? And I took this from a word frequency, it was a word frequency dictionary that does American soap operas, right? So I figured American soap operas are pretty close to everyday English, and you can see it's about half and half in adult language, right? Half from Latin, half from German, 50 most frequent nouns. And if we take CELIX, which is academic English, you can see that it's now become 96% Latin. So that was a kind of an interesting, and you might wonder, okay, why did I get interested in this? And it's because I spent a lot of time in Germany, and I kept feeling like, so just a little bit on my language history, right? So I grew up simultaneous bilingual. So I would spend time in Mexico, most of my education in English, but a year when I was 14 in Mexico, a lot of childhood summers in Mexico. And so I was simultaneous. But then I learned Portuguese at 20, although it's kind of an interesting story. I had exposure from a record that my dad bought me that I used to sing to in Brazilian Portuguese when I was a little kid. I have tapes of it, so there's actually proof that I could. I had a very thick Spanish accent in Portuguese at the age of like 7 or so. So when I went to relearn it at 20, of course, it was kind of relearning, but it was learning. But in all of those languages, I always felt like it fall to some kind of, I could always find a word, right? It might not be the, correct word. As one time I told my dad, I think I'd been a year in Mexico and I came back and he asked me how I was. And I said, I was very content. And he kind of laughed because contento in Spanish means you're happy, but in English, it just kind of means you're satisfied. So he thought it was interesting that I was using the Spanish word, but didn't have the same meaning. But I could do that. It might not work perfectly, but I could always find a word. In German, I could not find words. It's like it's like I had, nothing would come out. So I was trying to figure out why that is. And I finally figured out that I had to think about English without any Spanish for me. And then I could get into German, right? So that's why I got very interested in this idea. And I found this, I looked at these data and I said, whoa, okay, so that's why I think about it. Well, it turns out English, and I kind of joked to people that I didn't learn English the right way, right? Because my English was learned along with Spanish. So this is not what my most frequent nouns looked like. relative to a monolingual. So then I said, okay, that's fine. That's really nice observation. That's really nice data. Let's see, can we find more data to support this point of view? So I looked at, this is from a school in Washington State, in a district in Washington State, looking at the percentage, the origin of prefixes and suffixes learned by grade level, basically taught at school. And you can see that very early, right, in first grade, it's basically ed, ing, right, these prefixes and suffixes, undervalue, I suppose, like, that's again unter, so that's a Germanic prefix. And it continues like that in second grade, but in third grade, you start to see Greek and Latin pop in. And by the time you get to 8th grade in the US, right, in Washington State, you can see that it's basically become a Latin, Greek prefix and suffix class, because there's just very little left to learn in English, or Germanic, sorry, if you will, Anglo-Saxon Germanic, right? So again, there's like this transition that we saw at the lexical level, we see at prefixes and suffixes. So this is another study done by Hartshorn, Tenenbaum, and Pinker, right, where they looked at this idea. They actually looked at English performance on a test of syntax, and they gave it on Facebook. So it's a 10-minute test, and they were able to test 2/3 of a million, right? So that's a very catchy term. I guess it's kind of like the simple writer, right? So 670,000 subjects. Now they're up to 1 million. They actually have gathered more data, right, to confirm this. And the interesting thing about it is that because they had so much data, they argue that the critical period for acquiring syntax is around 17. And the reason, and you might say, but wait, people who start at 17, they say, no, if you have to start sometime before 17, but there's a drop off in the ability to learn a second language around 17, according to them on their test, right, with all these subjects. So that was the one finding they had. But the interesting part about it back in the discussion was that it depended on, and I talked to Hartshorn about it, and he's very, he has 2/3 of a million. So for him, like, if he only has, 50,000 subjects, he doesn't think there's that much power. But still, I think for most of us humans, human experimenters in the world, 50,000 would be great. But anyway, he looked at the different origin, right? So the L1, the first language of the L2 learners. And so he looked at simultaneous, right, learners of Chinese, if you will, and English. Those who learned the second language, English, between age 1 and 5, and those who learned it between 6 and 10. And so what you see is that for a Romance language speaker, I'm very lucky, right? So as a Romance language speaker, the best time to learn English, according to Hartshorn, and get the best proficiency is simultaneously. If it comes between 1 and 5, the performance drops, right? For West Germanic, it seems to be a little bit lower, which is kind of interesting. You would think that it would be helpful. So that's kind of an interesting finding. For West Germanic, the best time was between 1 and 5. And for Chinese, Mandarin, in this case, was between 6 and 10. So this is a really interesting finding, right? It suggests that, right, the entrance into English has this wide window in childhood for West Germanic speakers, but a more narrow window for Romance language speakers. And I think that would go back to the whole point of, right, how you get into English, right? But, and again, we could sort of speculate about this, but I thought it was an interesting finding that there were differences. And I've talked to Rosetta Stone about, like, don't you have like English for Mandarin Chinese speakers or English for Romance language speakers? I gave a talk for Rosetta Stone one time, and they said, no, we don't really think about it, that we just teach everybody the same. And I thought, well, but wait, everybody has a different entrance depending on their L1, right? But anyway. So then what I did is I had wanted to really verify this in a much larger data set. So I had this dream of trying to do this, and I downloaded the English Lexicon project, all the data from David Belota and the work at Washington University in St. Louis, where they collected basically so reading, so basically what they call naming or reading out loud times, lexical decision times, and also accuracy, right, for something like 40,000 words. And then I took Brisbart, his group has done a work on age of acquisition in English, and I combined both of those databases to come up with 20,000 something, 20,000 plus words in English, right? That had reaction times to them. And so then I said, okay, well, what happens when we do the etymology? Now, the etymology for 20,000 words is not the kind of thing you give to an undergraduate research assistant and tell them, okay, here are the 20,000 words, go and rate them. So I actually did it as part of my class. I have a class on the bilingual brain, and I thought they were going to hate me, and they actually ended up loving the task, because we would do a certain number of words every week, and then we'd come into class and talk about different words, right? And so they would learn about these words, and they go like, I never thought about that. And so we'd have these long discussions, including the one bruder and frater, right? Which we had a discussion about, is that Latin or is that Germanic? And so I stood around the room and I said, what do you guys think? Does that look like an English word or like a Latin word? You know, because we had been talking about this, they were sensitive to it, and they said, no, that definitely looks like a Germanic word. So I said, let's call it Germanic, even though obviously its real origin is Latin. So we did that. And we threw out words like tuxedo. So we learned, one of the students in the class learned that tuxedo was because there was a country club in New York where people would go with these very fancy, suits. And so they started calling them tuxedos because it was Tuxedo Park, right? So she was like, I never knew that that's where the word tuxedo came from. And I said, I didn't know either. So we learned a lot of stuff. We enjoyed it. And we did all these 20,000 words. And what you can see in these 20,000 words is, again, confirming what we've seen in these other types of data, right? Which is basically that, again, right, you get this early sort of Germanic, right, or Old English set of words, and then this huge Latin wave. It's actually kind of hidden by some words that are still Germanic that are learned into high school. Things like seafarer and wayfarer that are learned later. And down here, what you have is the age of acquisition of that word rated by adults. And here I put in frequency, so how frequent the words are. So you can see that these Germanic words are frequent and they're learned early in life. And then we start to add in Latins there pretty early, right? But it really comes in as this wave that's kind of under this. Although German still stays in there, and we still have compounding and things going on in English. Almost as if it were two languages, having this sort of settling process of trying to figure out, how do you make words in English? Which is kind of an interest. Do you compound like you do in German? Because there is still some of that. Or do you take a Latin word? And it does show compounding, right? So you do see that, like someone was upended, right? You do see words like that, but it's much less so than German, right? Most likely what you would say is someone was upended. Maybe I'd use the word dismantled, right? I'd go to a Latin word. And this is just an example of the early learned words, like things like grandma, right? Birthday. And then later on you have things like enjoy. Again, you begin to have things that are from Latin. And then as they get older, this is again older words like playable, they become again, these are Anglo-Saxon words. And then by the end you begin to see more and more Latin words. So there's this sort of blending in of the Latin words as we go across time, where it becomes much more Latin-like here at the age of 12, and much less Latin-like here, much more Anglo-Saxon, right, at the age of 2 or 3. And we can see this in the word astronaut, right? So Astron, star, nautus, sailor, or the German Weltraumfahrer, which is literally world room farer, right? So again, an interesting two ways of creating, right? So you have compounding in the Latin and Greek words that we've kind of lost. German maintains the compounding in the Germanic, right? And it's not that there's not compounding in the Latin, but again, it's not as transparent, which is a whole other interesting view. So this led, really the sort of end of the talk is very theoretical, right? Which is this idea of emergentism. So this is John Stuart Mill, who suggested that when you take two things, this is hydrogen and oxygen, you put them together, they transform, they become something else, right? So really what we're seeing is that when you put humans, right, in a situation, right, they're a natural system. And so we adopt a natural system view, really a lot of it from kind of, I always go back to biology or I go back to evolution, thinking about how organisms change across time, right? So my description in the Bilingual Brain, the book that I wrote on bilingualism and the brain, I described it as two languages as being in this two species in the same ecosystem that have to compete sometimes, that can share resources sometimes, right? And so you have this very sort of dynamic process between the two systems going on that's similar to what happened in the natural world. And the only way I could really visualize this is actually something from evolutionary biology, right? So there's a Ostman, who's this researcher at University of Pennsylvania, created these visuals for species that adapt to an ecosystem, right? And so this is a fixed landscape, and the species, it's a species, that's what these dots are, adapting to it. So that's what you see here. So it's a little bit slow, but you get the idea, right? That eventually the entire species adapts to a fixed landscape. And then we can see a dynamic landscape. And I think this really represents sort of not just bilingualism, but human sort of development, right? Which is, there's dynamic landscapes. So the landscape changes and the species has to adapt, and then it has to toggle, right? It just happens to be that in this video there were two, right? So we can think about bilingualism that way. It has to toggle between these two different systems, right? So there's this level of flexibility and adaptability that goes into having to learn language. And we can see this in early versus late acquisition, right? That early acquisition, so this is again an old figure that I developed looking at it, you know, and at first I kind of had a planetary description of what bilingualism was. And then I realized, and that's not really a good idea, because when two planets collide, they're kind of, you know, there'll be space dust, and that's really not what we think happens with bilingualism. But we could think of it as a sort of cellular thing, right? So in the case of simultaneous bilingualism, you could have, you know, these two cells basically that sort of coexist, right? And are there from the get-go. Or you could have the second system that becomes kind of parasitic. You can also have what I call orphan languages, right? So that's language, you know, you would call them like fully attrited languages or lost languages. So for example, when I was young, my mom stuck me in home care with a lady who was from Iran, who spoke Farsi to me for a year. And my mom claims that I would respond. She would come pick me up and I would respond to her in Farsi. I don't speak Farsi now. So somewhere in there, there's some kind of little something of Farsi in my head, right? Probably phonological. That's just kind of sitting there, right? And it's sort of been absorbed by the entire system of my language, right? By the other languages, but it's still there. It's still playing a role. It's just not a language per se. And I end with this idea of neurocomputational emergentism, right? Or neuroemergentism, as we call it. This idea that, you know, there's a sort of emergentism, the sort of naturalistic emergence of function that happens, right? And that, you know, the brain is in a way computing, right? And computing is kind of an interesting word to use because you might think of it as a computer, but really what we're talking about is sort of a calculation, right, if you will, a network, right, having to settle and handle, you know, multiple tasks, right? And so I don't want to say that our brain is completely a general processing mechanism, right? There are specializations within our brain, but there's a lot of flexibility in how we can tune our networks to different types of tasks. And so that's the idea here we have in neurocomputational emergentism. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Arturo. It was an amazing talk, and we have already some questions. Of course, I remind everybody that you can raise your hand now to ask questions to Arturo, or just type in the chat. So we have a question from Sohar Eviatar. She says, so interesting for the generated study. Did you look at the hemispheric balance of both cortical and subcortical dopamine? It's related to processing to novel stimuli. Can that be related to language learning?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So our dopamine, we haven't done dopamine imaging yet. So we've just done the genes and made an association between the dopamine and the genes, right, and the location of it. But ideally and you know, of course, a lot of people get into the thing about like, well, this is genetics, and what does genetics have to do with bilingualism? And they think about, you know, maybe like genetics, like people are better language learners or not. So we don't know about the hemispheric balance. One way we could do it is to use PET, you know, positron emission tomography, which is really expensive. It's something like 30,000 for the tracer, and then something, I think I want to say 5,000 per subject, right? Something like that. So it becomes a $100,000 project. And you can imagine these days to try to convince any government, right, that's trying to fight COVID to spend $100,000 on trying to figure out the brain bit, you know, the dopamine, the basic dopamine and bilingualism. But to answer your question more directly, right? So the way we, you know, clearly dopamine is not associated with bilingualism, right? So some of the people that I originally talked to were shocked and saying, wait, are you trying to say that like dopamine means you become a better bilingual? I mean, it could be. It could, right? Because you do need flexibility, but it is a general flexibility that could be reflected in bilingualism. So that's the way I think of it, right? It's that you need these sort of general flexible systems to be able to adapt to more than one language, and that plays a role in your balance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? I cannot see nothing in the chat.
There was somebody who had raised their hand earlier. I think Andrea was the name.
Earlier, not now, I think. I cannot see. So no more questions?
Oh.
Maybe someone will be, the one who raised the hand maybe will appear, I hope.
Yeah, it actually happened to me there was a bilingual brain, symposium before Society for Neurobiology and Language, and the same thing happened. And then I asked some students afterwards, like, why were there no questions? They're like, we were just all kind of stunned by your talk. Like, we didn't even know what to ask. It took about 5 minutes for a couple of people to save me in that one. But I think it's because it's like very different.
Yes. We have a comment from Melody in the chat. Thank you, fantastic and inspiring talk. There is a substantial research in dopaminergic reward system at play in language learning. A speculative question regarding dopaminergic system is, would you expect bilingualism to contribute to maintaining its functionality at a higher level and thus help prevent PD? Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's always a chicken egg question, right? Because now so much, I mean, I'm reading a book actually on genetics and development. And so I've been reading it recently, and yes, okay, so there's a question, right? Could there be some biological marker of this flexibility that could be reflected in you know, increase in dopamine? The gene we have is one that's not changing across life, so it's definitely fixed, right? That's also probably one of the criticisms because it's such a small effect. But I mean, I'm kind of out of my element when I try to answer that question. But yes, it's possible. We'd have to do the right kinds of studies to see that and to look at whether there would be an effect of bilingualism. And the problem, of course, is that, and I always try to go back to a more tangible sort of analogy. So there's a book called The Sports Gene, which is written by David Epstein, and it's about essentially, genetics in sports, right? So, and there we have basically genes towards body type. And so one of the things he mentioned in that book, which really is a nice analogy, I think, to this is, there's a trainability effect. So there are people that look identical, but when they're exposed to, certain environments or certain experiences, some react differently than others, right? And so there's always the issue of, is it the experience or is it a latent difference in the individual that's been triggered by this experience? And so I always wonder that about bilingualism, but I mean, it's plausible that there could be a training effect. I kind of have to be on the fence and say, I really don't know. It's possible.
Any more questions or comments?
Somebody had a comment in the chat.
There is one from Federico, not a question, but rather a comment in the chat. Bad.
Thank you.
See this?
Federico says that I am aware of one study finding an effect of bilingualism in delaying Parkinson's disease from Saidi et al. 2019. Bilingual speakers postpone symptoms of cognitive deficit in Parkinson's disease. Innovation in aging, and the reference is there in the chat.
That's very fascinating. I mean, the other thing, I didn't present it today, but we have been doing some work on reproducibility. So this is the only worry I have here is when we have, so you might remember I talked about this novel word learning task where we had 16 subjects in each group. And it turns out that over more than 15 years, we've accumulated 400 structural scans, like 260, something like 200, it's almost close to 400, over 200 bilinguals and 150 monolinguals. And so we did two studies, two papers that came out, but the one that really stuns me the most in brain and language is that we were able to actually take from our big groups, small groups, and randomly, create groups of 10, groups of 20, groups of 30. And so I always ask people to try to guess. So there's one figure that's very sort of clearly stands out here is the difference between a true positive and a false positive. So we found what people find in the literature, which is that true and false positives are the effect size is inflated when you have smaller n's, smaller groups, smaller sized groups. At what point does a true positive and false positive diverge? How big do those two groups have to be in people? I always ask people to try to guess when that happens. We went from 10 all the way to, I think, 100. So 10 per group, 20 per group. Anybody have a guess? You want to guess? Somebody said 20.
Somebody said.
I guess you can do a poll. I could actually do a poll, couldn't I? We've been really well prepared. We would have had a poll in here, but that's okay. Yeah. We're still adapting to this online world. So somebody said 20. Anybody else want to take a guess in the chat? How many people? Say that?
Say 50, for example.
50. So we have 20 and 50. Sounds like an auction, right? Going once, going twice. 70 is the answer. So the true positive and false positives diverge, those lines diverge at 70 per group, right? So I always worry about, and again, in patient groups, you can't have lots of patients. So in this paper that was written by Brandon Munson, so a former graduate student, basically the way we kind of got out of that was to use multivariate analysis. So you have more than one dependent variable. And in those cases, you can get a better idea when you have multiple dependent variables. It's a better way. So if in brain, we could do are these two groups different across 3 or 4 different areas, right? Or even like some connectivity analysis, if you will, between in structural imaging, which some people have started to do. Then if we have this network that's different, it's easier for us to say it than if it's just one data point, right? So multivariate analysis seemed to help sometimes maybe having a theory, and sometimes maybe replication, actually running the study a second time with a small group, just to see if you replicate, because the effects are so inflated. You could still inflate them. So the only thing I worry about patient work is they're not really big groups. And so we have to be careful again about our interpretation. I mean, this thing has really set me off. I mean, I had actually David Birdsong came to Brandon Munson's when it was a poster, and he said, can I present this at a talk? He says, what are you going to tell, National Institutes of Health? Are you going to tell them you need 70 subjects per group? Or you can ask them for double the money, triple the money to do your studies? I mean, we just have to be careful about small groups. And again, I have a publication with 16 and 16, and so I'm very hesitant to make claims about that, because now I know that could be an inflated effect, because I might have just chosen the 16 bilinguals that were different than the 16 monolinguals. So yeah, that's interesting, and I want to look at that, because I do think that there should be some relationship, but I'm very cautious about that. These days.
Well, yes, it is a study that is published in this journal that I wasn't really aware of before. It's recent. I don't know if, and it's a single author study, so it has it raises some questions, but it's the only one I'm aware of.
I mean, it's a hypothesis again, right? So we could argue about whether there's a flaw or there are not enough subjects, but it's a hypothesis that can be tested, right? So in the end, that's what we do in science, is test hypotheses. So I mean, I've heard a couple of people ask about Parkinson's and that with bilingualism, and I think that's an interesting question that probably could be addressed, especially in a place like Houston, where we have this big medical center, and there are lots of patients, of any kind of patients. So that's probably something that they have them, and they're just like, well, we don't test them because we don't know the language, or we can't assess them, or we have all this assessment data, but we don't. We've never used it in that way. So that would be an interesting question. Thank you.
Any more questions? We have time still. Or comments, or let me check if there are some hands raised.
Okay, if there's no further questions, I think we can congratulate ourselves on the first session, which went smoothly. Say thank you to Arturo for a fascinating talk. And also have a wee break now, so we can have about 40-minute or coffee, or even a sandwich if you're that fast. And we will reconvene at 6 p.m. Moscow time